Morning, Jamie.
Morning. Happy Sunday.
Yeah, happy Sunday. So good to see you again. And I mean, what a well, not just this week, but last week as well. It's been enormous on many different levels in terms of what's been happening, in terms of things like your essays and the content around executive functioning and um, things that are happening with your other podcasts with Barry Present, and then of course your article being published. But we'll save some of that for another chat. Let's talk executive functioning today. And
Aye.
I just love your description of the Chronos and Kairos. And as a person with ADHD, it really helped me. Apart from anything else, shifting that layer of shame that I often feel because Chronos is something that I don't fit into easily. So
Well,
maybe talk a
a
little
lot
bit.
of this, I mean, yes, and good morning, and all of that stuff. But I think, we did the unmasking and we do the executive function.
Yeah,
I'm laying the groundwork in my mind and in the relational field for the eventual field guidebook that's eventually will come out. Right. And I'm also, on Instagram and, elsewhere, and I'm seeing conversations about executive function. And I read the memes and they're very well meaning and, in my opinion, quite wrong. And when I read them, I have kind of a negative reaction that, as a school teacher, for example, we should be training children to the clock. And that to me seems very behaviorist, right? My neck hairs go up and, into warning. I'm like one of those Rhodesian ridgebacks that I'm ready for battle or whatever. But I don't like, behaviorism in anything. And I just, having kind of an old person's um, knowledge of things in terms of, world history and culture and stuff, to me, it made sense to talk about these different clocks, Chronos and Kairos, and, the clock time, the linear time versus meaning time. And it seemed very possible to me that Gestalt processors exist almost totally naturally in Kairos, and, analytics work very well in Chronos and our systems are geared towards Chronos. And so a lot of that therapy talk, and memes and so on was around conditioning children and, over on LinkedIn, conditioning adults
mm,
to have, these skills around living in Chronos.
yeah.
Right. And all sorts of kind of anti-colonial things started popping in my head or whatnot. But I just thought, why can we not do just a discussion around a different definition? Why do we have to assume that Chronos should rule? Why should we, as Gestalt processors, have to train our minds to work in such a way? There's a translation cost, there's a spoon cost, if you will. And so for me, I wanted to let Kairos speak, right? And so that's why, from a craft standpoint, these pieces came as poems first. And then, in my own kind of hold apart way, it's like, oh, wow, okay, that came out. Now let me explain what I mean. Right. And oh, that came out, right? And I don't want to offend Leonard Cohen by explaining my poems, but I do need to explain them sometimes. But that's kind of where this was going, that, in order for the field guide to work, we
Hmm.
have to start we have to start defining things for ourselves, not necessarily rejecting the outside definitions, but framing them, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
it does. And it made real sense as I was listening, because I often listen to the recorded versions of these like the conversations between the two. I presume they're AI generated voices, but Um, as I was sort of driving, I kept thinking about how much resonated, not just with me, but with the children and the families and colleagues as well that that are part of life, and how with Kairos it's not also just about that feeling deep within, um, that with the rhythm, our rhythms, and it just made total and utter sense. And how much we do mask because we're trying to fit into a Chronos world that wasn't designed for us, and
Right.
it's so hard.
I think culturally, for example,
Mm.
my Scottish mind in an English system, right? And I don't mean any offense by this, but there is a scholar of Gaelic culture and Gaelic language that I really respect. His name is Michael Newton. And he writes, about what happened to the Gaelic language and the resurgence that's happening now and so on. And when I read some of his pieces, he teaches classes and he's got books and all of this stuff, but there's a there's a there's a connection, correlation, if you will,
Mhm.
that in the colonial sense of America and Britain in spreading English, right? That the power and the authority, as he says, when they would arrive on this colony, and they would tell people that English is inherently superior, and that for their own good they should learn it, right? And there was a college professor in Nigeria that I have his book as well. It's called, it's basically like Learn English, son, right? And the English, the Queen's English, the King's English, was installed in Nigeria in the colonies there, and so on. Um, but we're having conversations now at my school. We're having conversations in my family around how some words and some phrases that just don't work, right? If
Mm.
they're English, they don't sit right in the body, right? And so from that standpoint, like what there are certain words in Gaelic that make perfect sense to me that I cannot explain in English. In the same way that some of my students who are indigenous, they have family, language, and there's no way that they can translate that. English is a foreign language to them. It's not a second language. They have no desire to be bilingual, all of this kind of stuff. So all of this goes into this executive functioning thing to say that essentially, as a Gestalt processor, whose brain and body and system and relational field and all of this kinds of stuff, meaning time, works in Kairos almost exclusively, right? And then I have a translation into Chronos because this is America where I live, and I have, the bell schedule at school, and I
Mm.
must be at a certain place for an IP meeting, and I must, host my class at a certain time and stand by the door and greet the students and all of these kinds of things that Chronos does really well at. And I was also thinking about when I lived in Germany and how Chronos rules
Mm.
Germany with an iron fist, right? Well, at least when I lived there, right? But you could set your own watch by the train's arrival, right? And they were down to the second, and kind of a funny, ridiculous story, but taking the train from Frankfurt, nearby Heidelberg where I lived, and you go
Mhm.
through the German speaking world and you end up in Vienna and you go back, and then everything is on time to the second. And then we went to Italy and we were 15 minutes late. And I thought to myself, there's a lot of Kairos in Italy, where it's just like, yeah, we'll take, we'll have coffee, we'll sit here, and time has no meaning, and this kind of thing. Um, and that's the kind of life I like. I like chit chat. I like hanging out. And Teresa's giggling in the background about that too. It's kind of funny.
She's right. Yeah, we all love it. But I think I wonder in terms of thinking about Gestalt language processes and how you've described it from, how it feels internally for you. I wonder how, some of our listeners might be parents of children who are Gestalt language processors. How might it be impacting little tiny people?
Well, that's, I mean, there's a lot to unpack, right? When you have a little tiny person, and the only way as a parent of not so little tiny people anymore, what you say, we must go shopping, or we must get to school, or we must do these things, and you must gather your things, and you must not forget things, and all of these kinds of things. And oftentimes, where there is gestalt processing, there is autism, there is ADHD. And so it's very tough to say, in my own system, for example, where does autism end and ADHD begin? Where
Mm,
do those things end and gestalt begin? Right. And so I tried very kind of seriously to say, what what is affecting the clock? Is it autism? Is it ADHD? Is it, gestalt, whatever? And so from that standpoint, as parents, yes, we have appointments that we have to keep and so on, but for the most part, our family runs on Kairos. And I think it's a gentler place to be. I think, as we were talking before we started recording, there is a null state, a stage zero, as we're gathering things that families can have conversations about what feels right. And they can model and provide those scripts for children who don't have them yet,
yeah.
and they can be expressive. And I think that's part of that relational ecology that I think, Teresa and I have tried very hard not to be oppressively parenting, right? That
Mm,
we've unschooled our children, that they have a lot of agency over things, even, before they technically turn adult and all of that kind of stuff. We want them to draw their own conclusions. We want them to contribute meaningfully, right? And that's part of the ecology of the family. And then the cognitive ecology, uh, all of the things that make us us, I think it flows better, right? The field feels more stable, meaning seems to hold. And so, from that standpoint, time can breathe
yeah.
when you're not in a hurry because you don't have to be. And from that, a lot of things can happen. But I think, we as parents in our house, we don't we don't hold on to things that, don't make sense. If it doesn't make sense to do it, we don't do it, you know. And I don't know if that's a privileged place as such, that maybe somebody does not have the privilege. I know that from the unmasking side,
Mm,
that I did not have the safety to do certain things unmasked. And so I know there's a lot of that in there, but when it comes to the relationship between parents and children, and the other way around, children and parents, I would hope that children would feel safe, that they can share. And I would hope parents would help them have those discussions,
yeah.
right? That it would not be commandments, right? Um, and we've never kind of imposed that way. I was a
Mm,
footballer, therefore you must be a footballer. No, you don't like sport. I don't, fine, what do you like? That kind of stuff. Um, but I think there are so many cultural things that
mm,
we've unpacked in our family and kind of decolonized and deconstructed and all of these things and conversations around names like the names are placeholders when you're born. If you don't like them now, choose a different one. Tell me what you want me to call you. All of this kind of stuff. There's no, my half sister did our mother's genealogy going back to like the 1600s or something, and every man is named John Allen. Like, how creative is that? Right? And that kind of leads to the Scottish joke. Like, there's 5 approved Scottish names, right? And so mine is a derivative of James, I guess. And so, that's one of the approved ones. There's plenty of Jameses in Scotland, right? And Roberts and whatnot. But um, I think from getting back to that executive function thing, um, we as Gestalt processors, that kind of autoethnography thing, we have to be the ones that define it.
mm,
We have to tell the academy, this is how we define it. And
mm,
the sovereignty part of it says, in a sense, from my writing, this is how I define it, right? And so when I'm talking about it, this is what I mean. I don't mean it from the standpoint of behaviorism and training, and you must be able to, speak English with the right tone and tenor and show up and sit straight. And, ladies must not have their hair to a certain point, and, otherwise we'll think they're boys, right? None of that nonsense. I think Kairos sets that up perfectly.
mm, absolutely. And I think another part of me when I was reading and listening as well was just thinking that actually Marge Blanc's natural language acquisition, her framework, her protocol, whatever you want to call it, everything about it for me fits in with what you were describing with Kairos in terms of allowing space, allowing time, being in the moment, creating that relational connection with the children. And that's when we see learning, that's when we see um, children progressing, children communicating, children feeling safe enough to communicate. I feel like in my sort of previous life, as because I feel like I have life as a speech and language therapist before I knew about Marge, and then life after that. And I feel like the life before, there was always like, oh, I've just got to get this in, I've just got to do this, I've just got to make this work, instead of actually taking a big back step and saying, okay, let's just create connection, let's just see what's happening for this young person, let's keep them safe, let's look at what they are when they're ready, rather than me just modeling language or ridiculously for a long time.
Wow. I mean, all of that is amazing. And when I look at the body of work from Marge and how I've integrated it into my practice and how I've kind of semantically and professionally and personally moved away from just the restrictive language processor stuff and, gestalt everywhere. Um, I think about my own journey with language as a non-speaker, late identified, all of this kind of stuff, and how my brain had to gather scripts, right? I think it's kind of funny and then it's kind of sad at the same time that when I tell students of mine that I grew up in care, I was taken from my parents, I was given to another family. It was rough, I was out on my own at 17. I was illiterate. And all of these types of things that happen to you when you're functionally illiterate. Like I had scripts and stuff I can operate and I had jobs, but they were menial jobs and I was taking advantage. And when they look at me saying these things, they don't really have a conception of a poor white person or a white person who struggled. And so they don't believe what I'm saying, right? If you can conceive of it, you can believe it. And so, I mean, there's nothing I could tell them that would alter that. But because I had no safety, I was always kind of living rough, if you will. Um, there was no chance to develop beyond stage 3.
Mm,
And so there I stayed for the longest time. But that doesn't mean I was idle. I was gathering things. I just did have no safety, no place to really develop it out. But all of those scripts were there. And
yeah.
so then when I met somebody who gave me a bit of safety, gave me a bit of help and so on, then I rocketed through the rest of it. And it sounds a very odd thing. Today's article is, how are you this, high functioning or whatever, and then you're this level support needs. And so I kind of explain what those two things are, but we're always, we're always gathering these things. We're always hoping for a relationship in Kairos to happen so that we can have these kind of gentle chit chats and these relational moments when time has no meaning and we just sit and have tea and enjoy each other's company and listen. And I did a lot of listening and I did a lot of sorting. I did not have the safety or the freedom to do a lot of speaking, so I did not, right? And so people thought I was the quiet type. And as we can see now, I'm anything but that, right? But I think there's a lot there's a really a lot to unpack here because obviously gestalt processing is genetic,
Hmm.
brain wiring is genetic, and so then when I'm speaking about students to parents, usually in their presence, and I say things like, who's the autistic elder in the family? Who's the gestalt processor in the family? And it gets the parents thinking, right? Am I just quirky or, have I always struggled with this? And then we have a very long kind of Kairos oriented conversation about meaning time and setting up families for literacy and for support and all of, the wonderful things that brings families together. And I know that shocks them because they came expecting to like a 1 hour IEP meeting, and 3 hours later, I'm still telling them about, how to hang academic Spanish properly in the mind so that we can put the academic English next to it and it will make sense. They can translate things in their minds. But the system says to that family, your child is deficient because they don't have this vocabulary,
Yeah.
right? And I'm telling the system, read my book. When I talk about this, decolonizing language education talks about this, talks about the science behind this. If I'm a Gestalt processor and I'm in Mexico or Guatemala or Uruguay or wherever, and I don't speak Spanish because I'm indigenous, if I don't have any kind of academic understanding of things, there's no way you could put English on top of that.
No.
And so the struggles as they get into things, it does not matter if I have 20 minutes to complete an exam if I don't have the language, if I don't have anywhere to put the language. And so what we might say is an executive functioning deficit, right? They never start anything, they never finish anything on time. I don't buy it. I want to know why.
Yeah.
I have that curious autistic nature to me. I don't care about the what necessarily. I want to know why they're doing it.
Yeah.
And then when you get down to it, you realize that they have all of these struggles. The indigenous kids who come to California, it's assumed they speak Spanish, and not all of them do. But they're put in programs that orient Spanish and then relate it to English. And these kids struggle mightily. And some of them are Gestalt processors, amazingly enough, right? It's not just an English speaking thing. And so I
Yeah.
write, that's the latest book that came out last year. But we must understand this. And of course, the system does not, right? It blames other things. It tries to behaviorism its way out of it, as if we could train them, to have skills that it's just simply not possible without the right language to it. But that's where my brain has been this week.
Well, very much enjoyed your brain this week, as every week. I feel like that feels not it feels too short, but a good place to stop. But I feel like we need to keep this conversation going, and maybe we could talk a bit about this again next week if that's okay.
Absolutely. I think, the unmasking, the executive functioning, the non-speaking that I'm writing out right now that will be released into the next week, all of that is circling around creating that place where I can begin the work of the field guide. And my paper is a part of that as well. And my chat with Barry is a part of that as well, creating that relational field necessary for this creativity to happen, and for coherence in my mind to happen. But I think it's a good place to pause and let me get back to work writing things out and yelling at my computer about stuff. It's always great to have our chats, and I look forward to it every week.
Me too. Thank you so much. That has been really lovely.
It's my pleasure, and thank you.
See you next week.
All right, see you next week.